The stick made a sharp whistling sound as it cut through the air. 8-year-old Ethan's face contorted with rage. Eyes narrowed to slits, teeth bared in a primal snarl that no child should ever wear. "I hate you! I hate you!" he screamed. His small fingers gripped white knuckle tight around the makeshift weapon. Sarah sat frozen on the concrete driveway, her legs splayed out in front of her, blonde hair falling across her face, as she raised her arms in a feeble attempt to shield herself. The look in her son's eyes wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something familiar that sent ice through her veins. She had seen that same look in his father's eyes. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Put the stick down, baby." The boy raised the stick higher, his whole body trembling with fury over some perceived slight that had ignited his temper like a match to gasoline. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, tears mixing with the redness of his cheeks. "Drop it, now." The command came from behind them, firm and authoritative. Officer Reynolds stood at the edge of the driveway, one hand already moving toward the boy. His uniform cast a long shadow across the concrete as he stepped forward. "Son, put that down." Ethan's grip on the stick wavered slightly as he turned toward the new voice, momentarily distracted. It was all the time Reynolds needed. 3 quick strides and he was there, one hand wrapping around Ethan's wrist, the other prying the stick from his grasp. Sarah scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her son, but Reynolds angled his body between them. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she watched her little boy being restrained, hating herself for the sharp stab of relief she felt. How had they arrived here? How had her sweet baby transformed into this vessel of rage? The answer lay buried 7 years in the past, in memories Sarah had tried desperately to outrun. 7 years earlier. "Push, Sarah. One more big push." The delivery room lights were too bright, the pain too intense. Sarah gritted her teeth and bore down with all her strength, a primal scream tearing from her throat as new life forced its way into the world. "It's a boy." Through sweat-blurred vision, Sarah saw the doctor lift a tiny, squirming body. The infant's angry cries filled the room, his little fists balled tightly as if already fighting against the world he'd just entered. "He's got quite a temper on him," the nurse joked as she placed the swaddled baby in Sarah's arms. Sarah smiled down at her son, exhausted but elated. "Hello, Ethan," she whispered. "I'm your mommy." A shadow fell across the bed. Mark leaned over them, his broad shoulders blocking the harsh overhead lights. For a moment, Sarah saw something tender in his eyes as he looked at their son. He reached out with one calloused finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "Strong boy," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "He'll be a fighter." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. She didn't want her son to be a fighter. She wanted him to be gentle, kind, loving, everything his father was not. But she pushed the thought away. This was a new beginning. A baby might change things, might change Mark. It was the lie she told herself as they brought Ethan home to their small, 2-bedroom house, as Mark went back to work at the construction site. As the days blended into weeks, and the facade of domestic peace began to crack. The first time it happened, Ethan was just 6 weeks old. His colic had kept them up for 3 nights straight, his piercing wails cutting through the darkness like sirens. Mark had been working double shifts, coming home with dark circles under bloodshot eyes, temples throbbing with a headache that no amount of aspirin could touch. "Can't you shut him up?" he growled, stalking into the nursery where Sarah paced with the screaming infant. "I'm trying," Sarah said, bouncing Ethan gently. "He's got colic. The doctor said it might last for—" The rest of her sentence died as Mark slammed his fist into the wall beside the door, leaving a crater in the drywall. Ethan's cries escalated to hysterical shrieks. "Great," Mark snarled. "Now he's worse." Sarah turned away, shielding the baby with her body without even thinking about it. "Just go back to bed. I'll take him to the living room." Mark stood there, breathing hard, a vein pulsing in his forehead. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought he might hit them, but then his shoulders sagged, and he turned away. "Whatever. I've got to be up in 3 hours anyway." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in the rocking chair with Ethan, long after his cries had subsided into hiccuping whimpers and finally into exhausted sleep. She stared at the dent in the wall, at the cracked paint and exposed drywall, a warning sign she chose to ignore. Mark's temper was like a summer storm, unpredictable, sudden, and destructive. Sometimes weeks would pass in relative calm. He'd come home from work, ruffle Ethan's hair, kiss Sarah on the cheek, and they'd pretend they were a normal family. But then something would trigger him a bill they couldn't pay. A dinner that wasn't ready when he walked through the door, a toy left in the hallway, and thunder would rumble through their home. By the time Ethan was 2, he had learned to recognize the signs. His little face would go still and watchful when his father's voice dropped to that dangerous register. He'd silently collect his toys and retreat to his room, closing the door as Sarah had taught him. "Mommy and Daddy need to talk," she'd say, voice artificially bright. "Go play with your trucks." The arguments grew louder, the strikes harder. Sarah became adept at covering bruises with makeup, at explaining away injuries to concerned coworkers at the diner where she waited tables. "I'm such a klutz," she'd laugh, adjusting her sleeve to hide the finger-shaped marks on her wrist. Walked right into the doorframe. Ethan watched it all with those solemn brown eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. He stopped asking questions about the noises he heard at night, stopped crying when Mark yelled. Instead, he grew quiet, withdrawn, his emotions tightly sealed inside like pressure building in a faulty pipe. And then came the night everything changed. Ethan was 3.5. Mark had been laid off 2 weeks earlier, his construction company downsizing after losing a major contract. He'd spent his days at home, stewing in resentment, drinking away his severance pay, while Sarah picked up extra shifts at the diner. She came home late one night to find him sitting in the dark living room, an empty bottle on the coffee table in front of him. "Where have you been?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. "Work," Sarah said, setting down her purse. "Marjorie called in sick, so I covered the dinner rush." "Right," Mark sneered. "Work. Always working. Funny how you're suddenly working so much overtime now that I'm home all day." Sarah felt the familiar cold dread coiling in her stomach. "We need the money, Mark. The mortgage is due next week, and you think I can't provide for my family?" He stood up, swaying slightly. "That it?" "No, that's not what Sarah stopped, her heart seizing. "Where's Ethan?" "In bed. Where else would he be?" Relief washed through her, but only for a moment before Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "You didn't answer my question." What happened next played out like it had a dozen times before. The accusations, the escalation, her back hitting the wall. But this time, something was different. "Stop it!" A small voice cut through the violence. Ethan stood in the hallway entrance, clutching his stuffed dinosaur, eyes wide with terror and something else determination. "Leave Mommy alone," he shouted, his little body trembling. Mark turned toward his son, momentarily stunned into releasing Sarah. "Go back to bed, Ethan. This doesn't concern you." "You're hurting her." Ethan took a step forward, his dinosaur falling forgotten to the floor. Mark's face darkened. "I said go back to bed." When he moved toward Ethan, something in Sarah snapped. All the fear, all the shame, all the silent suffering crystallized into a single moment of clarity. "Don't you touch him," she said, her voice deadlier than she'd ever heard it. She grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him back with strength she didn't know she possessed. "Don't you ever touch him." What followed was chaos. Shouting, the sound of glass breaking. Sarah grabbed Ethan and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind them as Mark pounded on it, threatening to break it down. She called 911 with shaking hands, whispering their address into the phone as she held Ethan against her chest, feeling his racing heartbeat match her own. When the police finally arrived, Mark was gone. He'd taken the car, some clothes, and what little cash they had stashed in their bedroom. Sarah stood in the driveway, Ethan balanced on her hip, and watched the officers search the house, take her statement, compile their report. "He'll be back," she said numbly. "He always comes back." But he didn't. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not ever. Mark Saunders vanished from their lives, as suddenly as a tornado lifting back into the clouds, leaving only destruction in his wake. In the years that followed, Sarah worked to rebuild. She moved them to a small apartment across town, took on a second job stocking shelves at the grocery store, enrolled Ethan in preschool. She saved every penny, cutting corners wherever she could, determined to give her son stability, security, and love. But the damage had already been done. Ethan's nightmares started a few months after Mark left. He'd wake up screaming, inconsolable, unable to explain what had frightened him. During the day, he was unnaturally quiet around strangers but prone to sudden, violent outbursts with Sarah. He'd throw toys, kick furniture, scream until his face turned red. The preschool called her in for conferences, concerned about his behavior. "Ethan pushed another child today," his teacher explained gently. "When I asked him why, he said the boy was playing with his truck wrong." Sarah nodded, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "I'll talk to him." "Ms. Saunders," the teacher hesitated, "has Ethan experienced any trauma? Any significant changes at home?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't ready to face. "His father isn't in the picture anymore," she said finally. "It's been hard on him." The teacher nodded sympathetically. Children often act out when they're processing difficult emotions. Maybe a counselor could help him work through his feelings. Counseling cost money. Money they didn't have. Sarah was already drowning in debt, barely keeping their heads above water. The medical bills from her last emergency room visit the one right before Mark left, when she'd finally admitted that her fall down the stairs was actually a push had destroyed what little savings they had. So she tried to be both mother and therapist to her son. She read parenting books during her breaks at work. She implemented timeouts and reward systems. She held him when he cried and talked about feelings, and promised him over and over that she would never leave him. But Ethan was changing, hardening. The sweet baby who had once reached for her with chubby hands and gap-toothed smiles was disappearing behind a wall of anger. By the time he started first grade, the parent-teacher conferences had become a regular occurrence. "He has difficulty controlling his impulses," the school counselor explained. "When he gets frustrated, he lashes out." Sarah nodded, too tired to defend or explain. She'd picked up a third job delivering newspapers in the early mornings. Between work and sleep, there were precious few hours left for parenting. "I'm trying," she said simply. "We know you are," the counselor replied, her eyes full of pity. "But Ethan needs more help than we can provide in a classroom setting." The phrase conduct disorder was mentioned. Referrals to specialists they couldn't afford. Sarah collected the papers, promised to follow up, and added them to the growing pile of problems she didn't have the resources to solve. She was losing him. She could feel it happening, could see Mark's face reflected in Ethan's angry expressions, could hear Mark's voice in Ethan's yelled insults. Genetic or learned, the rage was being passed down like a terrible inheritance. The summer Ethan turned 8 marked a turning point. Sarah had scraped together enough for a tiny house rental in a slightly better neighborhood. Ethan had completed a school year without being suspended progress. Of a sort. They were surviving. Then the letter arrived. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope at the kitchen table, Ethan playing video games in the next room. Inside was a single page, the words scrawled in the uneven script she remembered. "Sarah, I found your address through a buddy who works at the DMV. I know it's been a long time. I'm writing to say I'm sorry for how things ended. I was in a bad place back then. I've been sober for 2 years now, working construction again in Phoenix. I think about Ethan a lot, about what I missed. He must be big now. Does he look like me? I bet he does. I'd like to see him, to see both of you, to try to make amends. I'm not asking to come back into your lives full time, just a visit, just a chance to say sorry to his face. I'll be in town the weekend of the 15th. Let me know if you'd be willing to meet somewhere public. My number is below. Mark?" Sarah stared at the letter, her mind racing. 5 years of silence, and now this? Part of her wanted to tear it up, to protect the fragile peace they'd established. But another part, the part that saw Mark's face and Ethan's expressions, that felt helpless against her son's growing rage, wondered if this might help. Maybe Ethan needed this. Maybe seeing his father as a flawed, remorseful human would break whatever cycle they were trapped in. She called the number that evening after Ethan was asleep. "Mark? It's Sarah." His voice was the same, yet different. Gentler, steadier. They talked for an hour, cautious at first, then with increasing candor. He told her about his rock bottom, about rehab, about the construction foreman who'd given him a second chance. She told him sanitized versions of their struggles, careful not to lay blame or guilt. They agreed to meet at a park near their home. Neutral territory, public, safe. Sarah agonized over how to tell Ethan. Should she prepare him? Surprise him? In the end, she settled for a careful half-truth. "We're going to meet someone special at the park tomorrow," she told him over breakfast. "Someone who's been away for a long time but wants to see you." Ethan looked up from his cereal, suspicious. "Who?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Your dad." The spoon clattered against the bowl. "My dad?" His voice was small, uncertain. "The one in the pictures?" Sarah nodded. They had exactly 3 photos of Mark in the house's high school graduation, their courthouse wedding, and one taken at the hospital the day Ethan was born. Sanitized memories of a man who had only existed in those frozen moments. "Why does he want to see me now?" Ethan asked, his face unreadable. "Because he misses you," Sarah said, the lie sticking in her throat. "And he's sorry he's been gone so long." Ethan was quiet the rest of the day, withdrawn but not angry. Sarah watched him anxiously, searching for signs of how he was processing the news, but his face remained a mask. The next morning, they dressed carefully. Sarah put on a sundress she hadn't worn in years, applied makeup, twisted her hair into a neat bun. Ethan wore his newest jeans and a button-up shirt that already strained at his growing shoulders. "Do I look okay?" he asked, an uncharacteristic vulnerability in his voice. Sarah's heart clenched. "You look handsome," she assured him, smoothing his hair. "So grown up." They arrived at the park early. Sarah led Ethan to a picnic table near the playground, her stomach churning with anxiety. What if this was a mistake? What if Mark had changed less than he claimed? What if seeing him reopened all the wounds they'd spent years trying to heal? "Is that him?" Ethan's voice broke into her thoughts. Sarah followed his gaze to the parking lot, where a tall figure was walking toward them. Mark looked older, leaner, his hair shorter than she remembered. But his walk was the same, that confident stride that had once made her heart race before it became a warning sign. "Yes," she said softly, "that's your dad." Ethan stood straighter, his eyes fixed on the approaching man. Sarah couldn't read his expression. Was it excitement? Fear? Anger? She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Mark stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving between them. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ethan, thank you for coming." There was an awkward moment where no one seemed to know what to do. Then Mark took a step forward, kneeling down to Ethan's level. "Hey, buddy, you probably don't remember me. I'm your—" "I know who you are," Ethan interrupted, his voice flat. "You're the man who hurt my mom." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her face flush with heat, shame and surprise washing over her. She'd never told Ethan explicitly what had happened, had tried to protect him from the uglier truths. Mark looked stricken, his eyes darting to Sarah's face before returning to Ethan's. Yes," he admitted finally. "I did hurt your mom, and I hurt you by leaving, and I'm here to say I'm sorry for that." Ethan's small body trembled slightly. "She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, pain lancing through her chest. She hadn't known he'd hurt her. "Ethan," she began, but Mark held up a hand. "It's okay," he said quietly. "He deserves to say what he feels." He turned back to Ethan. "I'm sorry she cries. That's my fault, and I can't take it back. But I'm trying to be better now." "Why did you leave?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why didn't you stay and be better then?" It was the question Sarah had asked herself 1,000 times. Why leave rather than change? Why abandon rather than repair? Mark seemed to struggle for words. I was sick, he said finally. Not like a cold. Sick in my mind. I was angry all the time, and I didn't know how to stop. I was afraid. He paused, swallowing hard. I was afraid I might hurt you both even worse if I stayed. Ethan's face was flushed now, his hands clenched into small fists at his sides. You left us with nothing, he said, his voice shaking. Mom works all the time. We never have enough money. The kids at school make fun of my old shoes. Each word was a knife, twisting in Sarah's heart. She'd tried so hard to shield him from their financial struggles, to make their life seem normal. I know, Mark said, and there were tears in his eyes now. I should have sent money. I should have helped. There's no excuse for what I did. Something in Ethan seemed to snap. You're right, he shouted. There's no excuse. I hate you. I wish you'd never come back. Before Sarah could react, Ethan darted away from the picnic table, running toward the wooded area at the edge of the park. Ethan, she called, starting after him. Let me, Mark said, rising to his feet. Please, let me try to talk to him. Sarah hesitated, every protective instinct screaming against letting Mark anywhere near their son without her supervision. But the genuine remorse in his eyes made her relent. Don't push him, she warned. If he doesn't want to talk, bring him back. Mark nodded and jogged after Ethan, disappearing into the trees. Sarah sank onto the picnic bench, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. This was a disaster. She never should have agreed to this meeting. Never should have opened this door. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Anxiety gnawed at her. She was about to go looking for them when they emerged from the tree line, walking side by side, not touching, but not arguing either. Ethan's face was tear-streaked, but calmer. They spent the rest of the afternoon in uneasy détente. Mark bought ice cream. They talked about safe topics: Ethan's school, Mark's job in Phoenix, the weather. As the sun began to sink lower, Mark checked his watch. I should get going, he said. I have a long drive back. Ethan, who had been growing progressively quieter, suddenly looked up. You're leaving again? Mark glanced at Sarah, then back to Ethan. I have to go back to my job, but I'd like to call you sometimes if that's okay. Maybe visit again when I'm in town. When? Ethan demanded. When will you visit again? Mark hesitated. I'm not sure yet, but soon. Sarah could see it happening, the hope kindling in Ethan's eyes, the desperate need for a father. And she could see what would follow when those promises inevitably fell through. We should head home too, she said, standing up. Ethan has school tomorrow. The goodbye was awkward, a handshake for Ethan, a nod for Sarah. As they watched Mark walk back to his car, Sarah felt Ethan tense beside her. He's not coming back, is he? He asked, his voice small. Sarah wanted to lie, to protect him from the truth. But hadn't lies already done enough damage? I don't know, honey, she said honestly. I hope he does, for your sake. But we'll be okay either way. We always have been. Ethan said nothing, but she felt something hard forming in the space between them, something that hadn't been there before. Mark called twice the following week, then once the week after. Then the calls stopped altogether. Sarah wasn't surprised, but Ethan was devastated. His behavior, which had temporarily improved after meeting his father, deteriorated rapidly. The outbursts became more frequent, more violent. He threw a chair in class, earning his first suspension of the new school year. He screamed at Sarah when she tried to discipline him, called her names that made her flinch. And worst of all, he started saying things that echoed Mark so perfectly, it was as if he were channeling his father's spirit. You're pathetic, he spat one evening after she'd confiscated his video game for refusing to do homework. No wonder he left you. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway of his bedroom, the game controller clutched in her hand. What did you say? You heard me, Ethan snarled, his young face twisted with an adult's contempt. Dad was right about you. You're weak. You're nothing. The words hit her like physical blows. Ethan, your father never. She stopped, unable to finish the lie. Mark had said those things many times, in the dark days before he left. But Ethan had been too young to remember. too young to understand. Unless, what did your father tell you? She asked quietly. When you were alone in the woods that day. Ethan's expression shuddered. Nothing. Ethan? He said you drove him away, Ethan burst out, tears suddenly streaming down his face. He said you nagged him all the time and made him feel bad about himself. He said you wouldn't let him discipline me properly, and that's why I'm so messed up. Each word was a blade, slicing through years of careful healing. Sarah felt sick. While she'd been sitting on that picnic bench, worrying about them, Mark had been poisoning their son against her. That's not true, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Your father was abusive, Ethan. He hurt me. He would have hurt you too. You're lying, Ethan screamed. He told me you'd say that. He said you always made him out to be the bad guy. Sarah took a step toward him, reaching out. Ethan, please. Don't touch me. He scrambled back on his bed, his eyes wild with fury and confusion. I hate you. I wish you'd gone away instead of him. Sarah withdrew her hand as if burned. I know you're upset, she said, struggling to maintain her composure. We'll talk about this when you're calmer. She left his room, closing the door quietly behind her, and then sank to the floor in the hallway, her back against the wall, silent tears streaming down her face. She could hear Ethan crying on the other side of the door, great heaving sobs that broke her heart. What had she done? In trying to help her son, she'd opened the door to the very influence she'd spent years protecting him from. And now Mark's poison was spreading through their life again, corrupting the tentative peace they'd built. The confrontation on the driveway happened 3 weeks later. Sarah had been called to pick Ethan up early from school after he'd gotten into a fight with another boy. The principal's voice had been grave over the phone. This is becoming a pattern, Miss Saunders. We may need to discuss alternative schooling options if Ethan's behavior doesn't improve. The drive home had been silent. Ethan sullen in the back seat, Sarah too exhausted to lecture. As she pulled into their driveway, she tried one more time to reach him. What happened today, Ethan? Please talk to me. Nothing, he muttered, staring out the window. Fighting isn't nothing. You hurt another child. He deserved it, Ethan said flatly. He was talking about me. Sarah sighed, turning off the engine. Violence is never the answer, Ethan, no matter what someone says to you. He shot her a contemptuous look. Dad says sometimes you have to fight to earn respect. There it was again, Dad says. In the weeks since their meeting, Ethan had invoked his father's wisdom with increasing frequency, despite the fact that Mark had effectively disappeared from their lives again. Your father, Sarah said carefully, is not someone you should be trying to imitate. You just don't understand, Ethan muttered, reaching for the door handle. You're just a... He stopped himself, but Sarah could fill in the blank. She'd heard Mark use that particular epithet enough times. Just a what, Ethan? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. What were you going to call me? His face flushed, guilt momentarily overtaking defiance. But then, the mask slipped back into place. Nothing, he said, climbing out of the car. Forget it. Sarah followed him up the driveway, frustration and helplessness churning inside her. How had they come to this? How had she lost her sweet boy so completely? Ethan, we need to talk about this, she called after him. About your anger. About what your father told you. He whirled around, his face contorted. Shut up about my dad. You're just jealous because he didn't want you. The words hit her like a slap. Sarah stopped in her tracks, staring at her son, as if seeing a stranger. Is that what you think? She asked finally. That your father left because of me? Ethan, he left because he couldn't control his temper. Because he hurt me. Physically hurt me. Many times. You're lying, Ethan shouted. Dad said you make up stories about him. I'm not lying, Sarah said, anger finally breaking through her exhaustion. Your father was abusive. He pushed me down the stairs when I was pregnant with you. He broke my arm when you were 2. He gave me this. She yanked back her hair to reveal a small scar near her temple. He threw a glass at my head, Ethan. That's who your father is. Ethan's face had gone pale, but the stubborn set of his jaw remained. You're just saying that because you don't want me to see him again. I'm saying it because it's true, Sarah said, taking a step toward him. And because I'm afraid for you. I'm afraid you're learning to be like him. Something dark flickered in Ethan's eyes. So what if I am? Maybe he's right. Maybe sometimes you have to be tough. Tough isn't the same as cruel, Sarah said. And what your father taught wasn't toughness. It was cruelty. Ethan's face twisted with rage. Shut up, he screamed. Just shut up about him. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a fallen branch at the edge of their small yard. Before Sarah could react, he'd snatched it up and was advancing toward her, his small face a mask of fury. Take it back, he demanded, gripping the makeshift weapon. Take back what you said about Dad. Sarah felt her legs give out, sinking to the concrete as terror and heartbreak overwhelmed her. This was it, the moment she'd feared since the day Ethan was born. History repeating itself in the most horrific way possible. Ethan, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Put the stick down, baby. The boy raised the stick higher, his whole body trembling with a rage too big for his small frame. I hate you! I hate you! And then salvation. A police car rolling slowly down their street. Officer Reynolds spotting the confrontation and intervening just in time. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the business card in her hands. The social worker had pressed it into her palm before leaving, her eyes full of professional sympathy. Call this number tomorrow, she'd said. They can get Ethan into an emergency placement in the Children's Behavioral Health Program. It's a 6-week inpatient stay, followed by intensive outpatient therapy. Sarah had nodded numbly, watching as they loaded her son into the back of a different Carnot, a police cruiser, but a county vehicle driven by a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard full of intake forms. Ethan hadn't looked back as they drove away. His last words to her still rang in her ears. I'm glad he left you. I wish I could leave too. The house was silent now, empty in a way it had never been before, not even in the dark days after Mark's departure. Sarah ran her fingers over the card, tracing the embossed letters of the Behavioral Health Center. Could they help him? Could anyone? Or was the damage too deep, the pattern too firmly established? She thought of Mark, wherever he was now, probably oblivious to the devastation he'd caused with his brief re-entry into their lives. Or worse, satisfied that he'd managed to poison their son against her one last time. The cycle of violence wasn't just physical, she realized. It was a legacy passed down, father to son, through words and attitudes and examples. Mark hadn't needed to stay to damage Ethan. The seeds had been planted in those early years, watered by that one toxic afternoon in the park, and now they were blooming into something terrifying. Sarah leaned back against the headboard, too drained even for tears. Tomorrow she would call the number. Tomorrow she would begin the process of trying to save her son from becoming his father. Tomorrow she would fight, as she always had. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of disaster, Sarah finally faced the truth she'd been running from for 8 years. Some damage couldn't be undone. Some cycles couldn't be broken. And sometimes, despite everything you did, despite all the love you poured into a child, the inheritance of rage would claim its due. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined their small yard. The branch Ethan had wielded still lay on the driveway where Officer Reynolds had tossed it. In the morning, Sarah would dispose of it, erase the evidence of how close they'd come to the point of no return. But she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like lead, that there would be other sticks, other moments of rage, other confrontations. This was just the beginning. Like if you enjoyed the story,